I'm here with Miranda Kaufmann, who's a specialist in early modern Africans in Tudor and Stuart Britain, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her research today and how it can influence perspectives on early modern history. So Miranda, could you perhaps just summarise your research interests for us?
So I researched the presence of Africans living here in the Tudor and Stuart period from about 1500 to 1640, and I found evidence of over 360 individuals living in Britain in that period. And I think I found things that surprised people. Sometimes when I told people what I was researching, they were like, "Oh, you mean slaves?"
Yeah.
I was like, "No, actually, I don't mean slaves, because actually the legal situation and the kind of practical experience that I actually found that people were having in terms of what kind of work they were doing, the fact that they were being paid to do it, that they were being baptised and marrying English people, and also were allowed to testify in court, for example, were all kind of indicators that actually they were actually free in this country, and that was certainly the way it was talked about at the time, both by Englishmen and by Africans, and sometimes together, as we learnt in that scene from Mexico in 1572. And I suppose more broadly, like from an early modern perspective, I think a lot of, because there's so much exciting stuff going on in domestic history at that time, with the Reformations and succession crises and all sorts of, the kind of things that get dramatised in the Tudors or whatever, we all get sucked into the marital and otherwise other difficulties of the royal family at the time or whatever, and we get quite insular. I mean, we sometimes might start learning about, fights with other European powers, but you very rarely get a kind of global perspective on the early modern period. You kind of vaguely hear about the New World, maybe, in the context of potatoes and tobacco or something, but you very rarely get, you don't really think about the kind of global world that was opening up in that period and how it affected England. But when you start looking at the African presence, then you immediately get access to those kinds of questions. And
sort of how the global world was experienced in a domestic sense. Because I very much remember learning at school that the early modern world was very white and everyone was the same, and that people all lived in rural communities, but obviously it really wasn't like that. So I guess also I will ask you, in terms of your research, how do you think it can kind of maybe transform the current thinking on the early modern period? And I know in your talk you were mentioning about how it's important that children in schools and that students at universities and also public history beyond, that people are more aware of sort of different type of history, or that they're more aware of a positive black history. And I just wanted to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think there is still in the sort of public image of the history of Africans, like the only thing anyone ever gets taught about is the slave trade, and I think that that has a lot of negative impacts. I mean, it's important not to pretend it didn't happen, and we have to learn about that period in our history, certainly. But I think that it can kind of lead to kind of continued kind of racist attitudes and not just from English people, but quite a lot of people of African descent. The only thing they've ever learnt about their history is the slave trade as well. So there's this kind of this link, this constant linkage of Africans and slavery, whereas in fact throughout human history all sorts of people have been enslaved. Even in the early modern period, a lot of European people were being enslaved by North Africans in the form of Barbary pirates who were raiding European coastlines. So I think it's important to rethink what our visual image of a slave might be, but equally it's really important to think about African history on the grand scale from earlier civilizations before European contact took place, and just re-envisage our conception of African history, and not immediately assume that any African in Europe, or even in the European world, was certainly enslaved in this period, because there's increasing research, not just in England but in other parts of Europe, which shows that plenty of Africans were in fact living free lives at that time in Europe, even in countries where slavery was legal.
Yeah, so they're kind of like a dual identity in some senses. Also, I was really fascinated by the kind of source materials that you were using, so using baptism records, death records, and also paintings. Where do you find the most fruitful research, and what kind of materials, or do you just synthesise them together?
I think I suppose it's fruitful for what? So in terms of numbers, the parish registers are the best we get for census in terms of statistics, but I've never been a massive fan of statistics.
No.
So, and yeah, statistically, the numbers of people in terms of British population, I'm talking about, are pretty small. So let's move away from statistics. What I actually really think are the most, the source material I would most like to sort of spend more time with probably are court records. I think the High Court of Admiralty records are probably worth a lot more looking through, because in court records don't always give you all the facts, and like any source, you have to assess it, and maybe not anyone tells the truth in court anyway, but you do get more of a story. In a lot of these court records, you get long testimonies of people saying, well, I was doing this and then this happened, and so it's more incidental, but you get more of a picture of people's lives than a one-liner in a parish register or a tax return or a household account is ever going to give you, really.
And you tend to find people of African descent giving evidence in court.
Yeah. Which in itself, I think, speaks volumes about their status.
And definitely. And in terms of how you communicate, because I see from your profile that you talk to universities and then you give public lectures like this evening, and then schools as well. How do you sort of deliver that information differently to sort of different types of education?
Well, I'm still working on that, because I fear that I often to a similar level, and maybe the 13-year-olds I spoke to last Friday didn't quite take as much of it in as in it. So I suppose I'm very egalitarian in my approach to speaking, but I suppose it's about gauging the audience and trying to figure out how much background information they've got, what they already know, and so try not to teach as a grandmother to suck eggs, but to sort of realise how much background, to sort of try and fill in the background details for people when they're not going to know them.
Yeah. Communicating history is okay. Thank you so much. That's brilliant.
Okay.